The Tigray Humanitarian Update. I'm your host, Duke Burbridge. This show is going to look a little different than the past couple of shows because you're not going to see my face so much. It's going to be a lot of voiceover, a lot of data, a lot of concepts to cover. I hope it's informative. What I'm trying to do is to establish a baseline where we are right now with the blockade. There should not be a blockade right now. We're 4 days from the peace agreement. The need for humanitarian assistance is urgent. The humanitarian agencies are ready to send convoys, food, fuel, medicine, other life-saving supplies into Tigray. The only thing stopping them is the Ethiopian government. I hope that this show can chronicle the rehabilitation of the Ethiopian government from an entity that has credible accusations of crimes against humanity, weaponized starvation, into a government that's at peace with the world and its own people and adheres to international humanitarian law. I have my doubts, of course. Anybody would, given the recent track record of Ethiopia. But we'll hope for the best. It doesn't matter what I think of the Ethiopian government. I'm inconsequential. I acknowledge that. What matters is whether or not the people of Tigray get the food and medicine that they need to survive. That's the only thing that matters when it comes to anything we talk about on this show. So we'll hope for the best. But this show will prepare for the worst. So, let's start the show. Today's episode is all about the data. It's important to establish where things stand at this moment, even though we really have no idea if this is a critical moment or not. We are 4 days into the peace agreement between the TPLF and the Ethiopian government, and so far the Ethiopian government has maintained their complete ban on humanitarian access in Tigray, in contradiction of the promise that they signed, which was to go into effect a couple of days ago, that would allow unfettered humanitarian access. There's no word from any of the mediators, international mediators of the peace agreement, about this violation of the peace treaty already, so it must be assumed that no one expected unfettered access to happen in the first place. This show is about the humanitarian crisis in Tigray, but my background for the past 15 years has been in peace building. Sadly, in most of the conflicts that I've covered, the humanitarian peace-building fields are adjacent. From a peace-building perspective, the process has somehow managed to take yet another step forward without doing anything to relieve the suffering of the millions of starving and displaced civilians in Tigray. I have bad news for everyone involved. Nobody starves peacefully. This is not a real step towards peace. This is driving Ethiopia further towards the forever war that nobody wants to see. From a humanitarian position, the peace treaty is a violation of international humanitarian law. UN member states like the US and the UN itself cannot be a part of a peace process that knowingly allows crimes against humanity to continue. I'm not making an appeal to American values or to the UN Charter. I'm talking about the proximity of the US, EU, and UN special envoys to a process under which hundreds of thousands of civilians are believed to have been killed. Of course this is a violation of US and UN ideals. The people of Tigray are being deliberately starved into submission by an authoritarian regime that has been credibly accused of unspeakable crimes against humanity, including deliberately blocking humanitarian aid during the conditions of famine, which I contend meets the threshold for genocide. The only crime that the people of Tigray have committed appears to be voting for the TPLF in the regional elections back in September of 2020. What else has the people of Tigray done? the civilians, the children, the pregnant women, the cancer patients. What have the cancer patients of Tigray done to forfeit their human rights? What have they done to face a punishment too barbaric to submit a murderer to? But setting his ideals aside, what is happening in Tigray, if it is recognized as a genocide, it would be hard to ignore the role of the U.S. and the UN of creating and maintaining the condition of impunity that the Ethiopian government enjoys, which is a key driver not only of the duration of the conflict, but perhaps more importantly of the brutality of this war. At what point does that become collusion? The legality of taking a gradualist approach to stopping a genocide is very suspect. Now, don't misunderstand me. It's common for a country to ignore their responsibility to protect. That's still very much a theoretical concept, something that we continue to fight for. But it's not common for the UN to actually cooperate or help conceal crimes against humanity or genocide. The US refusing to release the State Department's genocide determination, and the UN failing to report in open session the denial of humanitarian access to a population known to be starving, would appear that both of them are taking direct actions to conceal what's happening in Tigray. And if what's happening in Tigray is genocide, then concealing it would also appear to be a crime. But according to the provisions of the peace agreement, humanitarian access, unfettered humanitarian access, is being negotiated as we speak. And by that standard, the next food cluster report that comes out should talk about all of the food and fuel that's arrived in Mekelle. The logistics cluster should talk about all the trucks that have been sent. Things should be back up and rolling by this time next week, but they won't be. You might get a few more pictures. They like to send pictures. There's 5.4 million people that need food, and they need medicine, and they need shelter, and they need clean water. There's 5.4 million people that need that, and they will probably have pictures of 30, 40 people eating or receiving a bag of wheat. But of course, if you were somebody who placed wagers on horrible things, and you bet on Abiy keeping his word on something like humanitarian aid, you would be out of money by now. There's been so many broken promises when it comes to humanitarian access. This in December, first day of December, Antonio Gutierrez was in a press conference where he announced with joy and glee that the humanitarian blockade was lifted. Everything was going to be wonderful. He talked about there were 2 convoys. One had already made it. The next one's going to make it in the next couple of days. And so he said that problem's been solved. And he was right about those 2 convoys. I believe it was 64 trucks were able to enter, and those were the last trucks that entered for the next 3.5 months. And there was no retraction. So in conclusion, I don't have a lot of optimism about humanitarian access. Certainly not unfettered humanitarian access getting into Tigray. But this show, from here on out, will be looking at the distribution and the data and the access and the layers of the blockade. To establish a baseline to either track progress towards lifting the blockade, something that I believe is unlikely but could happen, or to track the further deterioration that we know must happen in Tigray if food and medicine and fuel continue to be blocked to civilians. So if you look at the chart and the table here, it shows the collapse of the humanitarian response in Tigray. The first week of October, more than 400,000 people received aid, with 100,000 getting a full ration. By the last week of October, distribution was limited to 50,000 people, with less than 5,000 getting a full ration. The next couple of weeks, we should see more people in the capital, in Mekelle, getting food because there's no way to dispatch the stock that's there to where people need it in the northwest zone and the central zone. Even in the eastern zone, where there is a clear path, there's not enough fuel to get any of the food there, and there hasn't been a shipment for the past 2 months. So there's no way to move the food that's in Mekelle, so it's going to the people there. Now, this is not to say that the people in Mekelle don't need food. They absolutely need this food. It's just they're not the only ones that need food, and they're the only ones now that can receive it because there's just no more means. There's no more humanitarian response. Food distribution has collapsed. Look at this next chart. It shows it a little bit more clearly. This is 2 months now, September and October. You can see that while Tigrayan families are being displaced throughout the region, the Ethiopian government is choking off food, medicine, other life-saving supplies, shelters, tents that they did not have, that they were already screaming about. By September, they were saying, we don't have enough tents for the people that are now displaced, and they still weren't allowed to bring them in. But this is why humanitarian assistance needs to be adaptive and robust, is so that when something like forced displacement happens, they can respond to it. They can surge their capacity, they can get food delivered to where people are going to be, because people have to move, they have to flee. They're fleeing conflict, they're fleeing their homes. In some cases, they're actually fleeing one IDP site for another. Sometimes that they don't even know where the next one is. They just know that they can't still be there when the Eritrean troops get there, when the Ethiopian government gets there, due to the horrible atrocities that have been pretty well documented over the course of this conflict. So that humanitarian agencies can't do very much to help the hundreds of thousands of people who are forced to flee their homes. They're stuck. So if you look at the map here of Tigray, you can see where the conflict, where the fighting has been active. You see in the northwest, it's been very active, in the north and in the south. What you don't see any activity is around Abala, which is where humanitarian convoys enter Tigray from afar. You also don't see any fighting along the route to Abala from Samira, where the warehouses are. What you see is, starting around October 17th, Shire becomes an area where humanitarian assistance can enter. By the 20th, Adwa and Aksum were also occupied, as well as the majority of the route here that takes humanitarian assistance out west. These places have been shut down. But by October 17th, there was no more capacity from the humanitarian agencies in Mekelle to transport humanitarian assistance. So by the time that you could actually say that conflict was blocking humanitarian aid, it had already been blocked by the blockade. So conflict wasn't blocking it. The next series of charts and tables reflect how I would like to track the humanitarian blockade and hopefully the lifting of the humanitarian blockade. All of these numbers should be 0 right now, according to the peace agreement that was recently signed and is now in violation. But there hasn't been any humanitarian access. There hasn't been any movement on the humanitarian front since those agreements were signed. Right now, 100% of people in need, as defined by the World Food Programme's recent assessment, are still being blocked by the complete ban on food and fuel and medicine and other supplies into Tigray. That's also 100% of the IDPs, of course. Now, the ban on fuel, that only affects 90% of the people in need, because about 10% of the people of need live in Mekelle, which is a place where they don't need fuel to distribute food. They do need fuel to operate hospitals there, to store things, to have refrigeration, because they're on generators, but they don't need fuel to distribute food, so they can't be affected. Now, this is 15% of the IDPs because a larger number of IDPs live in Mekelle than in other places. The third layer is the people who have been blocked from humanitarian assistance by military occupation. This has always been the case in western zone of Tigray. It's always been the case. And when I say always, I mean since the beginning of hostilities in November 2020. It's always been the case in the border areas with Eritrea. The Irob, for example, the people who have been blocked by the fighting have been blocked for 2 years now. God knows how many people have survived this long with no food, with no medicine, with no access, basic services, anything like that, with Eritrean forces who have been credibly accused of human rights violations, gross human rights violations. Under their occupation, nobody knows how many people are alive because nobody can even do assessments. There's just no access being allowed in. But since the most recent offensive, they've taken considerable amount more ground. So about 70% of the people in need are blocked off, and about 76% of the IDPs, because of course the displaced population is higher in areas where there's fighting, and in areas where they're fighting, it's the level of military occupation, the ground gained by these groups that won't allow humanitarian aid into these areas where there are people who desperately need it. The amount of territory that they control expands. So this is what it looks like right now. If they had access to food and other supplies, if these were allowed to be able to transport into Tigray, then 10% of people would be lifted from the blockade. So no matter how many convoys you see going into Tigray, if there's no fuel and just food and medicine, this would be a wonderful thing for the people of Mekelle, but it would mean nothing to anybody outside of the capital, because without fuel they couldn't transport it. And after 2 months without any delivery of fuel into Tigray, they don't have any more. There is no more fuel to dispatch. If food and fuel were allowed into Tigray, if the ban on humanitarian assistance was lifted by the Ethiopian government, but there was still an occupation of the current cities and territories that are under occupation, and they still were not allowing UN partners to transit these areas, even to get to other areas further west or further, or outside of the major cities that have been taken, then 30% of the people in need would have access to humanitarian assistance. That's it. So until all of the layers are blocked, until all of the layers are unblocked, rather, you still have a significant amount of the population in need. A significant amount of the IDPs in Tigray are not allowed to access desperately needed, life-saving humanitarian assistance, food, medicine, shelter over their head. They're not allowed to get to. This table brings it into a little bit more detail. As noted, the second layer of the blockade, the one that's relying on fuel, only affects 90% of the population. It doesn't affect the people of Mekelle. If you look at the third layer, the people being blocked right now by military occupation, this only affects certain zones where there's significant amount of occupation or where they're cut off from Mekelle by a military force that will not allow humanitarian access. Now, importantly, the people in the eastern zone, the people in the western zone of Tigray have been blocked for the past 2 years. So they're in very bad shape. Also, the IDP population behaves a little different. They, because of the fact that there are a great deal of people in Mekelle, of IDPs in Mekelle, then the second layer of the blockade that's relying on fuel only impacts 85%, not 90%. So about 15% of IDPs could get humanitarian assistance if the ban was lifted into the capital city, but no more than that. If you look at the number of IDPs that are blocked by conflict, this is a little higher than the number of just the general number of people in need, because of course displaced populations are generally close to combat. So where the Eritrean military and the Ethiopian military or the Amhara Special Forces or the Amhara militia have taken control of territory or roads, this has blocked off about 76% of the IDPs. So that's where things stand right now. That's where we are. Now, this is a couple of days since a peace agreement was signed. All of these should be zero. Like I said, nobody should be blocked by any layer of a humanitarian blockade. There's no part of this that's legal. There's no part of this that is in compliance with international obligations, but they're still being blocked. And to open up one layer, layer 3 should be completely out the window right away. There shouldn't be anybody blocked by layer 3. But if it was out the window, if there were no more occupying forces preventing aid from coming into the areas that they control, you would still need supplies. You'd still need fuel to get that aid out there. So they could announce today, hey, every humanitarian convoy that wants to come in to serve the people of, let's say, Tigray, you're welcome to it. They could say that and still block 100% of the people in Tigray because there is no fuel to dispatch any humanitarian supplies because it hasn't been allowed into Tigray for the past 2 months. Unfortunately, we see a lot of this sort of activity where they'll lift, let's say, layer 1, at least partially. They'll allow food and some supplies, usually not medicine. This has been very difficult to get through. But food and some supplies will be lifted, at least partially. But the only beneficiaries of that are people in Mekelle. And maybe they could send a couple of trucks out to places where it's urgently needed. But that's it. Nothing like the humanitarian response that's supposed to be happening right now. And the Ethiopian government can play around with all 3 layers of the blockade because all they need is one layer of the blockade to block 100% of the humanitarian response to these areas. So when you see people celebrating a convoy coming through, or even 10 convoys coming through, if it doesn't have fuel, then these convoys are only destined to get to Mekelle. Nowhere else. Nobody else benefits. So we can see, if we look past the past 12 months, you can see this is the best visual representation I can give you of the impact of the layers. Of course, if any layer exists, then the food, and the supplies are 100% blocked. In November, they allowed about 200 trucks to get in. They didn't allow any fuel. There hadn't been any fuel for the past couple of months, so that food, those supplies, couldn't go anywhere outside of the capital of Tigray. Then they blocked food and fuel and medicine, all supplies, a complete ban for the next 3.5 months. So everything was under the blockade, the first layer of the blockade. In April, they allowed a very small number of trucks. April 1st was the first convoy. By the end of April, there had been fewer trucks in April than there had been in November, before they had a ceasefire, before there was a lifting of the blockade. They allowed a lot of fuel, They could have gotten more supplies, more places, but that they didn't have the supplies. Then the number of trucks getting in to Tigray increased, but the level of fuel getting into Tigray did not increase. So for at least 2 of the 3 months that this was open, they didn't have enough fuel to do anything but return the trucks back to the warehouses in Afar. By August, everything had changed. For the first time in 2 years, they allowed enough fuel to actually dispatch food from the capital of Tigray into places like the northwest zone and the central zone and the eastern zone, where there were a significant number of people who needed it. These places had gotten intermittent delivery of food, not very little else, but food was able to get there in a couple of trips because they were able to take some of the fuel that was allowed in before that to dispatch food, but it was certainly nowhere near what was needed. But in August, they were able to actually effectively mount a humanitarian response. This lasted for a couple of weeks, and then they shut down humanitarian access again. Now they say they shut it down because of the conflict, but it actually shut down a day before the conflict resumed. So you can take that with a healthy dose of skepticism. But even though they completely banned humanitarian assistance from getting into Tigray after the last week of August, they were still able to distribute food in the places where it had already been dispatched from the fuel that had already gotten in. So September was the best month for food distribution that they had ever had for the past 2 years, because this brief moment in time, this single month, almost an entire month, they were able to respond to the humanitarian crisis in Tigray to the best of their ability, to the best of their resources. This is what they can do. They can feed this many people, enough people who need it. They can get food to these people. They can get them fed. They have to have the fuel. They have to have the supplies. They have to have access. They had all of that, with the exception, of course, of the Western Zone and parts of the Eastern Zone that were on the border with Eritrea. The Arobe, for example, still was not able to access food or medicine or any humanitarian supplies because they were still under occupation. Now, this lasted a couple of weeks, maybe, in August. Then, with the offensive, that third layer increased dramatically, mostly in October, a little bit in September when they took Shiraro in the extreme northwest, but Shire didn't fall until the middle of October. The other cities, Adwa, Aksum, fell in I think the last week of October, but they were still able to get a great deal of distribution happening in September. But of course, as we noted previously, that all collapsed in October. And this is where we stand right now. 100% of the people in Tigray who are in need of food assistance are blocked. 100% of the people who need of IDPs in Tigray are blocked from receiving medicine. In many cases from receiving food, although, as noted, in the capital there is enough food to distribute for a couple of weeks because they don't have any fuel to get it out of the capital. So until the blockade lifts, until that first layer lifts and the second layer, they can't do anything. They can't respond to the humanitarian crisis. The response is at a standstill. The people are starving, and nothing can be done to save them until they allow more food, more fuel in, and allow that food and fuel to get across the line of control into areas that absolutely need it. We have a peace agreement between the TPLF and the Ethiopian government, under which the Ethiopian government promises to allow unfettered humanitarian access to civilians who need food, medicine, other life-saving supplies. They didn't agree to one convoy. They didn't agree to one tanker. They didn't agree to one shipment of medicine. They agreed to allow humanitarian agencies to determine and deliver the amount of aid that's going to be necessary to keep people alive. That's how it works. That's how it works anywhere where international humanitarian law is being followed. It's time for the Ethiopian government to stop its criminal activities when it comes to humanitarian aid. They talk about law and order. It's time for the Ethiopian government to practice what it preaches. They don't have time. Tigray does not have time to play more games with food and medicine. They need humanitarian aid, and they need it now. And we'll see what the international community does if all we get is excuses next week. They've been covering for the Ethiopian government for a long time. This idea that aid is being blocked by conflict, it's not being blocked by conflict. They signed a peace agreement 4 days ago. How many trucks have gotten in? It's being blocked by the Ethiopian government. The Ethiopian government needs to stop blocking humanitarian aid to civilians. What we need to do, if the Ethiopian government won't stop blocking humanitarian aid to civilians, is tell the truth, speak directly about it, and find alternative mechanisms of compelling the Ethiopian government and